So recently, I've been thinking about the one existential question that has plagued philosophers and thinkers throughout time. And that question is, could Batman replace some of the greatest main characters in anime?
Bruh.
To find out, I dived into the deepest crevices of the internet, like Wikipedia and fandom. I noted down the numbers, I put them in my spreadsheet, all in an effort to find out the easiest to hardest word for Batman. Whoosh. First up, we have Monster. So for power level, it gets 1 because the people in the story, they didn't have any specific powers or anything. For his victory condition, he'd be facing up against Johan, but he doesn't have any special powers that would make him particularly difficult to deal with. A bit similar to the Joker, but we can't assume that he'll be on the same level as the Joker. Overall, I'd give this a 2. And finally, we have the world difficulty. This is the amount of threat and danger he'd have to face in this world. So in Monster, it wouldn't be that much. This also gets a 1, and all of this combined, it gets a low C tier ranking. After Monster, we have 3 series, which are pretty much on the same level, so consider them to be interchangeable with each other. First up, we have Vagabond. So for the power level, it's a 1 because all the people are pretty much normal humans. None of them have any supernatural powers. Yes, they are skilled, but Batman is equally as skilled as they are, so the power level is pretty much equal across the board. For victory condition, he gets a 1 because he's pretty much gone back into the medieval age. The world difficulty is higher because the past generally had more lawlessness compared to present time. So all of these things considered, the world difficulty is a 3. And this also puts it in the C tier, along with Vinland Saga and Kingdom, because I see them in a very similar light and I think they're rather interchangeable with their medieval times. There's widespread war, there's lawlessness, and small factions have a lot of power. Next we have High School of the Dead, which was a world filled with zombies. So for the power level, I'd put it at a 1 again because no one has particularly supernatural powers. I think Batman would be pretty well suited to deal with them. For the victory condition, I'd give it a 2. And for the world difficulty, I'd also give it a 2. All of this combined, it also goes into the C tier above everything we've seen so far. Next up, we have Airgear. The people are pretty comparable to normal humans. They just have a slight degree of power-ups that make them stronger than other people. But it doesn't set them so far apart that normal weaponry would not be able to deal damage to them. So because of that, the power level is 1.5. Then we have the victory condition. For this, I give it a 2 because Batman would have to face people with some degrees of powers. Some of them would be smart, some of them would be dumb, some would be easier, some would be harder. Finally, we have the world difficulty. In this case, small factions would have a lot of power because of the Airgear, and it would allow them to exercise their power negatively, so because of that, I'd put this at a 2 as well. All of this combined, it gets another C tier ranking. Airgear is joined by 3 other series in this ranking, specifically Duel Masters, Medaka Box, and Beyblade, because the amount of power-ups that they give are very comparable, and it's not like these people get completely out of control and advance so far beyond human technology that they cannot be contained anymore. So because of that, they all have the exact same ranking. Whoosh. Now we're entering the B tier, and we're going to be started off with 2 series that are on the same ranking, specifically Death Note and The Breaker. But I'm going to be looking at them individually because I think their context is rather different. First up, we have The Breaker. So the power level here is a 2. Everybody was pretty much a martial arts expert, and these were like powered up martial arts, so they were way stronger than like an average person. Along with this, the victory condition is also a 2 because Batman would have to struggle against multiple martial artists that have really strong techniques and would be a difficult hurdle to overcome. And finally, we have the world difficulty. There are multiple factions that can also wield power in this, and they can be a threat and affect people negatively. And so all of this combined puts Breaker in the B tier. After this, we have Death Note, where the power level is 2, mostly because of the supernatural powers that come with the Death Note and the amount of control a person can have over the entire world because of that Death Note. Then we have the victory condition. So Batman would essentially be facing up against Light and pretty much on the same level as Monster, so I'd give this a 2 as well. And the world difficulty is a 1. For Pokemon, the power level is 2 because the Pokemon are definitely stronger than the average person. For the victory condition, it would have to be beating the Elite Four, which took a 12-year-old 25 years, but I think Batman could do it much quicker. Because of all the people, Batman would definitely be able to min-max the Pokemon to achieve his victory. It would be a struggle, but it would be something that he could achieve. And finally, we have the world difficulty, which would definitely be extensive as there are a bunch of wild Pokemon with pretty strong powers roaming around, and they could be a threat to any person. And because of that, the world difficulty would have to be a 3. All of this combined puts it on the B tier as well. Pokemon is joined on this ranking with Sekirei, which is pretty comparable in its world and its abilities, as instead of Pokemon, people have those powers, so it's pretty much interchangeable. This is a pretty comparable world to Pokemon and Sekirei, but the only way it differentiates itself is from the victory condition, specifically because the skill level, expertise, and danger posed by people is higher here as compared to Pokemon and Sekirei. So because of that, it's only a slight bit harder for Batman to win in this world as compared to the ones before. Then we have 3 series on the same ranking. specifically Beelzebub, Deadman Wonderland, and Konosuba. I'm going to be talking about Beelzebub and Deadman Wonderland first because the worlds and the challenge that Batman would face in these is relatively similar. So the power level for both of them is at 3 because they all have a lot more power than the average person. For the victory condition, they're both at the same number at 2.5. Then we have Konosuba, which has a power level of 2.5, so it's a bit lower than the ones we just talked about, and that's because the power ceiling is not quite as high. Then we have the victory condition, which is mostly just trying to survive, occasionally trying to deal with some magical enemies, but they're not too strong, and having a good team can help him deal with that situation relatively well. So the victory condition is also a 3. Finally, the world rating is also a 3, similar to all the ones we've seen before. Whoosh. This tier starts off with 2 series on the same ranking, specifically Mob Psycho and Mushoku Tensei. First, let's talk about Mob Psycho. The power level is 3, as the people are definitely way stronger than an average person and they can dish out a lot of damage on a very large radius. Along with this, the victory condition is also a 3. And finally, we have the world rating. It's a 3, much like all the previous options. There are many dangers lurking about, and they're also very threatening and could deal a lot of damage. Then we have Mushoku Tensei, which has a similar power level at 3 with similar amounts of damage output and power ceiling. And then we have the victory condition, which is also at a 3. And finally, the world is also a 3. So all of this combined, they're both on the same ranking at the start of the A tier. After this, we have multiple series on the same ranking. It's including ReZero, Hunter x Hunter, Digimon, JoJo, Cyberpunk, and Fire Punch. So let's start with the first one with the lowest power level, Cyberpunk. So the power level is a 2 because the people do have some augmentations and improvements to make them stronger, but they don't really have supernatural powers which would be beyond explanation. It's mostly just future tech and cyborgs that are a bit more powered up. Yes, there is the Sandevistan, but the power up is not so much that the weaponry during those times cannot handle them. Then we have the victory condition. Victory condition is a 4 since Batman would have to be up against Arasaka and Militech, which are like behemoths in the industry, and they control so much of the city itself, which would be really hard to take over. We haven't really seen anyone actually accomplish that very well. And then finally, the world rating is also a 4 because they control a lot of the areas with an iron fist, which was very hard to deal with, and I think even Batman would struggle in it. So because of that, it's a 4. Now, this is an isekai world, and there were a lot of magical powers that they had here. The world itself is also a bit inhospitable, so because of that, the power level would be a 3. As for the victory condition, that will also be a 3. The sheer amount of control was not as extensive as Cyberpunk, but there were many threats around the world. There was the witch cult, and there are small factions that are also making it a bit harder. And defeating the witch cult itself is going to be a bit of a difficult task. And then finally, we have the world rating. Many people have magical powers, so because of that, it makes the entire thing a bit harder. Small factions can be a threat, and they can also pose danger. So because of that, that gives this world rating a 4. Next, we have the OG isekai, Digimon. So for the power level, it gets a 3 because they're super powered pets, and generally they're stronger pets than Pokemon by a considerable margin. So the victory condition for this would be a 3. And then finally, for the world rating, they can pose a considerable amount of threat and danger. So because of that, the world rating is also a 4. Then we have Fire Punch. For the power level, it's a 3. They have a considerable area of effect with the amount of powers that they have, and they can deal a considerable amount of damage because of them. So the victory condition would have Batman facing up against the superpowered people and the Ice Age world that they're in, which would be an uphill battle for sure. So for that, the victory condition is a 3. And finally, for the world rating, it would be a 4 because there are people that have a considerable amount of power, and the Ice Age generally makes things a lot harder and more inhospitable. Then we have Hunter x Hunter. For the power level, it's a 3. They have a wide area of effect, and we've seen them scaling up to a considerable amount of damage as well. So yeah, it's a good 3. Then for the threat types, a lot of people have diverse superpowers. It's kind of hard to pin down the kind of superpowers they have, but they're definitely a wide variety of them. Along with this, they have a very high battle IQ. They're tactical, they're strong, and they're creative, which is a good combination. The victory condition here would be a 4. And finally, we have the world rating. It's a pretty big, expansive world. Some parts of it are definitely threatening and dangerous, but there are also some parts that are relatively peaceful. So because of that, the world rating would be a 3. Now after this, we have JoJo. Now I haven't seen all of it. I've seen the first 2 parts and a bit of the third part. I kind of stopped at the third part. Pretty much the same as Hunter x Hunter. The world rating overall is not that devastating and dangerous. There are some peaceful pockets where threats can be avoided. So because of that, the world rating is a 3 and the power level is also a 3. After this, we have another rank above this where we have 3 series: Full Metal Alchemist, Code Geass, and Demon Slayer. Pretty much interchangeable with regards to how difficult it would be for Batman to win in them. But let's start with the first one, Full Metal Alchemist. Power level is a 3 because the amount of damage and devastation that a single person can dish out is quite considerable, and it's a lot higher than an average person. For the threats, the superpowers themselves are a threat, so the victory condition here is a 4. And the world rating is also a 4 because there are multiple people with a lot of power. And in the same board also comes Code Geass and Demon Slayer. Code Geass Chaos in its world also has mechs. The victory condition for both of them is also a 4. They have to overcome a strong opponent in a very dystopian world, which would be hard to overcome. Hell's Paradise fits in the same category with Demon Slayer, Code Geass, and Full Metal Alchemist. The power levels are pretty much comparable. The victory condition is also seemingly equally as difficult, as there's a really strong entity at the top of it all who's hard to take over. And finally, the world rating is also similar because there are threats looming everywhere with people having special powers that are hard to overcome. So the very last one on this tier is Fairy Tail. The power level in this is just a slight bit higher, but the victory condition would be easier because there isn't a particular battle of wits or some really strong entity that Batman would have to deal with. So that's a 3 there, and the world rating is 4. Whoosh. The power levels in these animes are at such a high level that at this point some sort of a science fiction weapon or ability would need to come into play in order to actually defeat these characters. All of these animes are power leveled according to that thought that none of these can be dealt with by traditional weaponry. First up we have Bleach. So I've only seen up until the 1000-year Blood War arc. Judging on that, there is some level of planetary powers. The power level for this series would have to be a 4. For the victory condition, that's a bit hard as well. It's definitely in the higher end of the difficult ones we've seen so far. So that would also be a 4. There's a very strong entity and the smaller factions are also pretty strong. And finally, the world rating is also 4. Just random characters have a lot of power and they can deal a lot of damage. Increases the level of danger this world has to throw. After that, we have solo leveling. The power level in this is a bit higher. It's definitely on one of the highest levels we've seen because the amount of damage and control that was exerted in this world was nearly on a planetary level. Because of that, it's a 4.5. The threats would be a 4. And finally, the world rating is 4. Or whether it's one of the hunters or it's one of the monsters that come from the gates, there's a big possibility that they might cause a lot of chaos. Then we have One Piece. One Piece has a power level of 3.5. I think that the power ceiling is a bit lower than both solo leveling and Bleach. But where it does get a bit harder is the victory condition. Covering so much ground while defeating so many enemies is going to be a tall order. Then we have Attack on Titan. The power level is a 3. There are some supernatural powers, but not quite as destructive as the powers in Bleach, solo leveling, and One Piece. There's a widespread war, so the victory condition is a 5. Then we have the world difficulty, which is on the highest level we've seen so far. Overcoming so many strong factions that want war is an extremely uphill battle, which I don't know how Batman would overcome it. This also goes in the S tier for being one of the hardest worlds to overcome. Then in the same ranking, joining Attack on Titan is Jujutsu Kaisen and Chainsaw Man as well, but the scaling for them is a bit different, so I'm going to be diving into them separately. For Jujutsu Kaisen, the power level is a 4. I think it's higher than Attack on Titan, as citywide destruction can be expected with the amount of powers that people hold in this world. For threats and the victory condition, I would put it at a 4 because cursed spirits are rampant and the sheer number of them is also quite extensive, which would pose a considerable amount of threat, and the villains themselves are also very smart. And finally, for the world difficulty, that's also another 5. Then we have Chainsaw Man, power level is 4, and same is the case with the victory condition. There are some very strong entities that are hard to overcome, which makes the victory condition and the sheer amount of threats that he has to deal with another 4. And finally, the world difficulty is also a 5 because there's a widespread amount of war with devils and the contracts that the devil hunters have. Then we have Naruto. For the power level, it's a 4 because the amount of destruction is again on the citywide level with the amount of power that they have. We've seen Pain dish out a lot of damage. For the victory condition, I think it's a bit harder. I think the victory condition is a 5 with strong entities, multiple factions, and a widespread amount of war with people having really strong ninja powers. Finally, we have the world difficulty. Again, there's so much war, there are so many factions that overcoming all of them would be a long and arduous task. So because of that, the world rating is also a 5. Joining Naruto on the same level is Berserk, where I think the power level is pretty comparable. The amount of threats and victory condition would also be a 5 because overcoming Griffith would be the hardest task, and he has an entire army of demons that have special powers. And finally, the world rating is also an easy 5. There are so many threats looming everywhere, multiple factions, and the kind of powers they have are also very diverse. And then we have the final 2. So first up, we have One Punch Man. The power level is 4.5. We've seen the ceiling of the powers be very high up, but we haven't seen devastation and destruction on the same level as the number 1 position, so I'll put it at a 4.5. Along with this, the threats are also on planetary level, and there are so many superpowers that many people can deal a lot of damage and you don't know where the threat can emerge from. So the victory condition is a 5, and the world difficulty is also 5. There are many strong factions, so overcoming them would be an extremely uphill battle. And then finally, at the very first position, we have the OG Dragon Ball, or Dragon Ball Z, or Dragon Ball Super, or Dragon Ball GT. beyond planetary, it's on a galactic scale at this point. So the threats are also abundant, and there are many factions that can pop up and deal a lot of damage and be a source of struggle for Batman. So the victory condition would be a 5. And finally, the world rating, I mean, if he's in the proximity of like some really strong people, he could just be blown away as collateral. So that's a very hard thing to overcome. But considering it's Batman, he'd still overcome all of the worlds we've seen so far. Like if I was to think how you would overcome Dragon Ball, Dragon Ball Z, and Dragon Ball Super, I mean, he can just get himself some of the Dragon Balls. Using that, he can deal a lot of damage, which no one can really compare with. There is definitely a route for him to win. It's just like theory crafting at this point. But I hope you enjoyed. These are all the anime that I've seen so far, and I've rated them according to how hard I think it would be for Batman to win in them. It's definitely subjective, and there is definitely argument for one to be higher than the other, but let me know your thoughts. Share them in the comments. And yeah, that's about it. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.